political corruption and economic recovery, the presidential election between Democrat Samuel J. Tilden and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes went down to the wire.
When the election returns finally come in, Tilden has won the popular vote, and all he needs is one electoral vote to be elected president. Unfortunately, 4 states send in disputed returns. The Democrats concede Oregon, the Republicans concede Florida. That still leaves 2 sets of probably both fraudulent electoral returns from Louisiana and South Carolina. 1 set going to Hayes, 1 set going to Tilden. The election is going to be decided by Congress. Unfortunately, Congress is controlled by the Democrats, the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, so we've got a deadlock there. So they set up a special electoral commission to decide the election. After some finagling and informal deals, the commission finally throws the election to Hayes, who needed all of those disputed votes to be elected president. In what becomes known as the Great Compromise of 1877, then, the Democrats concede the White House to Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Republicans agree to withdraw the last remaining federal troops from the South. In April of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes withdraws the last remaining federal troops from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, officially ending the great experiment in Reconstruction of the American South.
Though the troops were gone, an elaborate series of federal laws and constitutional amendments still protected the rights of African Americans. But in the coming decades, those rights and protections would be steadily eroded. Slavery may have ended, but in its place emerged what some historians have called a racial caste system. That is, a system of racial segregation and subordination, in which your place in society was fixed at birth by your race. Before the Civil War, King Cotton ruled. The American South grew 3/4 of all the world's cotton. It was cotton that had made the South rich, cotton that employed 3/4 of all slaves, cotton that had been the nation's greatest source of money from abroad. Financing the Civil War had left the nation deep in debt. When the war was over, there was a quick and sure way to pay off the national debt and get the Southern economy back on its feet. The answer was to restore the great plantations to their original owners and get the cotton back in the soil. But the 13th Amendment had ended slavery. So how would they grow it? The freedmen had no intention of going back to work in gangs under white foremen, and whites had no cash to pay wages. So they worked out a new labor system called sharecropping, based on credit. The deal was that the landowner would provide the land and supplies. The black farmers would grow the cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops, and at the end of the season, when the crops came in, they would settle up accounts and split the profit.
But there were problems that attended the system of sharecropping because the items that the landowner had made available to them on a loan basis were made available at very high interest rates. And if they did not come up with a harvest that was large enough, they went into the next year indebted. And that could be compounded by the fact that we're talking about sharecroppers who were by and large illiterate, but the books were kept by people who were more literate than them and the people who employed them. And that provided an opportunity for their further exploitation. So the end result was a system now that kept people constantly in debt and literally tied to the land.
Continually in debt, many Southern sharecroppers lived in conditions little better than slavery. A Southern Homestead Act passed in 1866 did enable a few thousand freedmen to get land, but this was only a drop in the bucket. And so back into bondage, many did indeed fall. In the decades following Reconstruction, the South systematically whittled away at the laws protecting the African Americans' rights. Southern whites ignored existing laws, then passed new Jim Crow laws that separated the races and forbade blacks from using schools, hotels, libraries, beaches, bathrooms, water fountains, the whole range of public life.
Segregation is simply the separation of the races. Generally, it is by the dominant group, the group that is in power. It can be based on the fact that they feel they are superior to one race, and it can assume really ludicrous proportions. In the United States, for instance, if you look at some of the old laws for segregation, there were laws that forbade blacks and whites who worked in the same building from looking out the same window. There were laws that said they could not use the same school books. But it was a very serious problem because after the Civil War, when blacks were freed, they weren't not given all the rights of citizenship. It was shortly after that that you have segregation beginning. And what segregation did was impose upon blacks who were already at the bottom.
To control their black neighbors, whites continued to use violence and intimidation, and the terror of choice was lynchings. By the early 1890s, white vigilantes killed more than 200 people a year for crimes real or imagined. Campaigns to strip black men of their right to vote were completed that same decade. Federal courts also hindered African Americans by chipping away at their constitutional protections. In the 1880s, a federal court ruled that those doing the segregating did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as they provided equal accommodations and services for blacks. When the Supreme Court upheld this notion of separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, segregation won constitutional sanction. In the coming decades, Southern states and municipalities would pass laws to create two societies, separate and unequal, that would remain on the books until the 1960s. Surveying the American racial landscape soon after the turn of the century, W.E.B. Du Bois would write,
"For this much all men know, despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. In the backwoods of the Gulf states, for miles and miles, he may not leave the plantation of his birth. In well nigh the whole rural South, the black farmers are peons, bound by law and custom to an economic slavery, from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. In the most cultured sections and cities of the South, the Negroes are a segregated servile class with restricted rights and privileges. Before the courts, both in law and custom, they stand on a different and peculiar basis. Taxation without representation is the rule of their political life. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of race."
Reconstruction was perhaps the most democratic, most revolutionary period in American history, in that one of the things that Reconstruction did was give all men the right to vote. The second thing was that we got public education throughout the South as a result of Reconstruction. Then, of course, the third thing that occurs in the South during Reconstruction is that you get a new level of civil rights. So Reconstruction, in my view, was one of the most democratic periods in American history. And it's just unfortunate that it only lasted from 1866 to 1877.
So it was a failed opportunity if you could have had the political will in 1865 and 1866 to demand more of white Southerners, that they accept their defeat, and part of the acceptance of that defeat would be a willingness to grant to their citizens among them, black citizens, an opportunity to get ahead economically and political rights so they can protect economic opportunity. That didn't happen. One of the things that did happen that is extremely important later on were the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments, that in effect provided the constitutional groundwork for claims for full citizenship that would be made in the 20th century and most vigorously after World War II in the modern civil rights movement.
Swept up in a period of unprecedented expansion and economic growth, Americans following Reconstruction dismissed the fate of African Americans as a Southern problem, best handled by the people who lived there. Attention now turned to America's bright future, which lay in the mines and fields of the American West. in the teeming immigrant neighborhoods and factories of the nation's booming industrial cities.